Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Seaton from Leicester University. She's a research associate in medical statistics at Leicester University. She's also secretary of Leicester and District Trade Unions Council and co-chair of the University and College Leicester Branch UCU. Please,
Does everyone mind if I stay sitting down? I can speak louder if I've got a bit of a cold, and if I stand up too long the room kind of spins a little bit. So I'm probably actually the least qualified person to speak here this evening. I think all the other speakers know far more about this than I do. However, the one thing I am qualified at is I am a maths graduate. So I can provide some maths, and I hope you'll humour me, but those that have heard me speak before will know that I like maths and I like numbers, so I will do a bit of the number speak. And since no one else has done it yet, I think it's always worth thinking about the scale of the problem with these kind of things. I was looking up in advance of this evening how many refugees and asylum seekers there are in the world, and there's 69 million people that have had to flee their homes for some reason or another. And that's kind of astounding when you think about it. That is, basically the UK has got up and left. It's absolutely shocking when you think about it, how many people have had to flee for whatever reason. They're in fear of their lives, their safety in some way. However, 85% of those people are cared for in developing countries. Only 15% of them are actually coming into the more developed countries, the wealthier countries, and the people who, in my opinion, are far more able to support them and to care for them. And the vast majority of them are ended up in countries that are still very poor and still suffering from many of the same problems that they're actually fleeing from, but are probably being far more welcoming to them than what much of the Western world is. There was about 610,000 people that sought refuge in Europe recently. And in the UK, though, we received 30,000 asylum applications. I mean, I just think that's appalling, personally, that the UK receives so little. And you constantly, I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the press about the migrant crisis in Europe and how our country is basically going to sink, it seems, because so many people are fleeing to our country. I really think that the UK particularly has a moral obligation to take in more of these people and then to actually look after them when they actually arrive here. I mean, we are all purely in this country, or those of us that have been born in this country by luck. We have not had to flee for our lives or worry about our own personal safety, and the only reason that has happened is pure luck. I could just as easily have been born in another place where I would need to flee for my life. And I get very tired when I hear people talking about, oh, you know, they're coming over here to steal our jobs or whatever. And it's like, well, do you know what it must be like to make that decision one day to flee? Perhaps without your family or perhaps with your family, because you are so fearful of something happening to you. As has been said already, you know, these aren't necessarily uneducated people. Many of these people are very intelligent people who have actually got a lot to offer their own country and our country as well. Of those 30,000 asylum applications that I mentioned, and lots of those are unaccompanied children, which I just find really quite, you know, distressing really, that children have had to make these horrific journeys on their own. Only 35% of them are granted asylum, so kind of what's happening to the rest of them? I don't even know if I want to dwell on that and think about that too much, because it's actually quite horrific. I know we're mainly talking about higher education this evening, but I'm sure others will mention it as well. I did want to briefly mention education younger than that, which I'm even less informed to mention, but I can't even imagine how difficult it must be for these children particularly entering this country, potentially being able to access education quite soon, although there has been changes in legislation, hasn't there, which other people will know about more than me, which means that even children sometimes can't immediately go into education. I'm sure you've all seen the news stories recently about all the 30-year-old man who's trying to go to primary school to acquire an education. Stories like that don't do anything to help these people. It's just scaring people, and actually it's probably just that these people need to access education in some way. But fleeing from your country, which maybe you've seen war or disaster, and arriving in the UK where perhaps you don't speak a word of English, and you're being flung into potentially a primary school environment with absolutely no preparation whatsoever. I think these children are absolutely incredible, how resilient they are, how they can just adapt and learn and get on with it, really. And it must be, just the other thing to mention is how, I don't know how they actually survive and afford to live and eat. So the benefit system does not, in my opinion, look after asylum seeker and refugees well at all. I mean, job seekers and so on has been mentioned. My understanding is during the initial few months they're here, they get around £35 a week, which I don't even see how that can feed a child at school very easily, never mind everything else that you need to pay for. And I know many schools, locally and nationally, go out of their way to support these children, providing uniforms and providing free school meals where they can, although these children aren't necessarily always eligible for it. So, not only have you fled something horrific, you're now put in a situation where you're going to be the child that's going to potentially be picked on because you're wearing a second-hand uniform that's from the lost property. So primary school education is also incredibly important. So I know we're talking about higher education this evening, and a lot of people will enter the UK at the point at which they would have been entering higher education, but the younger children obviously still reserve quite a bit of thought as well. I did read online when I was looking up about higher education and asylum seekers that apparently 1% of asylum seekers and refugees make it into higher education, which I thought was astoundingly high. I was surprised it was as high as that. However, I still think that's appallingly low. But I mean, I was pleased that some people are clearly being able to access higher education, so we are moving in the right direction. It's already been mentioned about the fact that there's been this change in the law since earlier this year, where I think you can't access higher education until you've been here for around 6 months or so. And I'm sure you will all expect me to mention the fees now. I completely agree. Financial fees are not necessarily the biggest situation here. However, it is massively prohibiting to get to university with those fees. So I personally went to university and paid an obscene amount of money for my education, and 10 years after graduating still owe many zeros of thousands of pounds for my education. However, I was eligible for student finance. Now, I don't agree with tuition fees, I'll come back to that briefly in a bit. However, I find it shocking that people that have had to flee for their lives, that have arrived in this country in desperate need, are then treated as if they're international students, as if somehow this country, where they are not wanted and they are not welcomed and they are not safe, is how they should be assessed for how much they should pay for their education. That means that they could be paying something between £10,000–20,000 for each year of their university degree. And add on top of that the fact that they've got to afford to live and eat. So these people are probably going to be graduating with towards £100,000 worth of debt if they don't get the support from universities. Now, I know we're going to hear a lot more about wonderful support that some universities are giving, but I just don't think that should even be a worry in your mind when you've had so many other things going on. But yeah, like I said, to be treated as an international student and charged international student fees potentially when you arrive in the UK and you've had all the trouble that you've left behind seems absolutely bonkers to me. I will briefly mention my own union. So the University College Union is probably the biggest union within the higher education sector. I can't not mention the fact that we obviously oppose tuition fees when, full stop, across the board. Don't believe that anyone should have to pay for an education in the way that we do at the moment. Education is, as it's been described, a human right. It's a greater good for society. My union suggested that perhaps an alternative way of looking at it was some form of business tax, which would be gained by reviewing the way that corporation tax was charged on businesses. The argument being that businesses and the private sector and lots of companies benefit from having people do degrees and from graduating, and perhaps it should be raised in that way. Now, that might not be the right way to do it, but it is potentially another way of doing it. But either way, tuition fees are something that need to be looked at perhaps across the board, but definitely in this group of people. Like I said, we're going to hear more about what some universities do. It's very much up to the university whether or not they want to support this group of people. I know things like Leicester University and the University of Sanctuary and all those things are absolutely brilliant initiatives. I would hope that anyone that wanted to study at the University of Leicester would be encouraged and a way would be found, but I really think it would be awful if someone actually had the capability but didn't have the financial resources. I mean, if you actually wanted to, I don't know how you could ever save up for one of these degrees if you actually had to pay international fees. I just think you'd spend your whole life saving to go to university. My union, UCU, also passed some policy a few years back where we acknowledged that people who have become asylum seekers and refugees have this need to rebuild their lives and reintegrate back into a community. And our encouragement to universities was that we wanted every university in the country to offer at least 10 scholarships to refugees and asylum seekers. So it was good to see some of those things being done, but I think that universities as the providers of education really have more of a moral obligation to step up and do a bit more here. And it's not just about tuition, it's also about their living costs and then about other support as well, which I'll mention in a moment. I mean, I was pleased to hear what you were saying about 62 of them offering scholarships. I mean, that's brilliant. But I wouldn't ask the other 62 of them, well, what are you doing? They get your finger out. I'm sure you can afford this, really. And if nothing else, I mean, think about what an amazing press opportunity this would be for you if you were able to show off about what you were doing with this group of people. I don't really think that finance is it all, is everything that is important to these people. I mean, it's probably actually quite a minor point in the grand scheme of their entire lives of what they're having to deal with. I think universities need to probably gear up towards how best to support these students when and if they are able to access higher education. This is a group that I imagine are going to have far more need for things like counselling services, mental health services, English language services, and these are all sectors of university life that are being cut more than ever, unfortunately, not just in universities, just across the board, to be honest. But this is a group of people that are going to struggle more. This is not a standard student arriving in university. This is someone that comes with a lot more baggage. I imagine quite a few of them might come with no family support whatsoever, having the complete uncertainty of what's going on back home, perhaps with the rest of the family that are at home. And this is a whole new issue that universities need to learn how they're going to deal with in some way. I think we just sort of need to move towards this idea of education being something that benefits everybody. I mean, Leicester is such a diverse city, and Ambrose has obviously held many events about the diversity of Leicester, and it is a wonderful thing, but it's something that needs to be celebrated in this group of people as well, that, you know, diversity is a good, and it's a good thing for education. I think in some ways perhaps we need to think about a different way of approaching teaching with well, students will start, especially groups of students like this. GCSEs, A-levels are very much the traditional way into university, and there are slightly more vocational things that you can do now. However, I think you can really rethink the way that perhaps university education is offered, perhaps across the board in many ways. I used to teach groups of mature students, and mature students are very different from a standard 18-year-old. They come with their life experiences and the things that they want to share. And it was mentioned that I teach in the medical school. I used to teach mature medical students who would come with they used to be a paramedic, used to be a nurse, used to be a psychologist, used to, you know, all sorts of things. And the conversations you can have and the way that you can learn with that group of people is very different from assessing a 2,500 word essay, which is often the more traditional way of assessing undergraduates. So I think that perhaps university education needs a little bit of a rethink just across the board of how best do we actually assess these people, and can we actually learn something from what these people are bringing to the UK, because I suspect there's a lot that can be learnt there that can't necessarily be captured in a more traditional essay or something like that. And I think my final good points are, I think we have to remember that there's actually a lot more to be learnt at university than just the education that you acquire when you're there. And I think that's true for everybody. I think university definitely teaches you a lot of life skills. I mean, when I did my degree, I definitely learned more than just the maths that I did. But I think you learn a lot more, but this group of people have a lot to contribute to society as a whole, and we can all learn a lot from people who have been in these really difficult circumstances. I'm going to end on a slightly different tangent, just because someone has to mention it this evening. I'm sure many people have seen the verdict of the Stansted 15 trial, which I think can't not be mentioned this evening, although it doesn't directly relate to education as such. A group of protesters who attempted to stop a flight taking off from Stansted Airport, which was full of people who had been seeking asylum or refuge in the UK, and the UK had chosen to deport them. Some of them, very questionable whether or not it was even legal to do it. They chose to stand in front of the plane and make it impossible for it to take off. Instead of being charged with trespassing onto the airfield and applauded for showing Stansted Airport a lapse in their security, in my opinion. But instead of being applauded for such a wonderful act of human rights and human decency, they've just been found guilty of terrorism offences today. And I think that unfortunately sums up all that is wrong with this country's opinion of refugees and asylum seekers. So, I don't know.